Before I start, there's three thank yous, sincere thank yous that I would like to give. One is to George Frost, who is the expert on the computer, which I am absolutely useless at, and has managed to put the presentation together for me, and is if it goes pear-shaped, I call him. And so thank you very much, George, for coming. The other one is very important, is my long-serving wife, Rhiannon, who's been sitting with me for 5 months to prepare this presentation. And I suffered, as you know, wives know, I suffered my frustrations, because what actually happened was that I was rung up by Yuan in May and said, "Can you do a talk for us, Merv?" And I said, "Yeah." And I said, "What on?" He said, "Well, it's the 80th anniversary of D-Day. Can you do D-Day?" I said, "No, everybody knows about D-Day, but I'm going to do it from the German perspective." Ooh, that's interesting. So I said that glibly until I actually went to do the research on it and found out the amount of work I didn't know. So that was it. And my third thank you is to my close friend, Colonel Peter Knox. Peter, I think he's been to Normandy 5 times this year?
4.
Oh, sorry, 4. 4 times this year. And he is my expert, because if I say, I don't know, he'll probably know the answer, because he's been there. So Peter and I go back an awful long time. I think about 1975. One. I was a child. And today I have met Jeff, who's my MO, and when I was serving, and he was 40. He said the last time we met was 40 years ago, when I had hair and a moustache. So on D-Day, on the 6th of June, and I shall only be dealing with the 6th of June, so don't go into the 7th or anything like that. D-Day, the 6th of June. A view of what confronted the Germans. It wasn't quite like that, but it was almost like that. If you think that D-Day was 7,000 ships, now that's one heck of a lot. 7,000 ships, hulls out to sea. 150,000 troops are landing during the day, with 12,000 troops on either flanks, the American 101st and 82nd Airborne, and our own boys on Pegasus Bridge, and 11,000 aircraft during the course of the day. That is pretty phenomenal. That's what happened on D-Day. For that, and as somebody once said, it was a long day. Why did D-Day happen? Well, there's lots of reasons. One was that we were committed to have a landing somewhere. Winston Churchill wanted the Mediterranean, but there were various sort of things against that. And also, Stalin in Russia was wanting another front to relieve the pressure on the Russians in their conflict and their great patriotic war, which is what they had there. So there was a lot of pressure to have D-Day, and also we were committed to opening another front. There may be other reasons, but those are the main reasons. I want to mention, from my own point of view, Dunkirk and Russia, because I feel these two aspects, or two conflicts, was where Germany lost the Second World War. They halted the panzers short of Dunkirk, where we were all tied up, for 3 days. Now, the reason they halted the panzers there was that the troops couldn't catch up with them logistically. But if the panzers had gone through and taken Dunkirk, then it would have been curtains for the Brits and the French. But that's my conjecture, is that's the first mistake that Hitler made, by not allowing the panzers to go through, the tanks to go through to Dunkirk, and we got away with 360,000 troops. The second one was Russia. At the end of the Second World War, Field Marshal Montgomery was asked about the Russians, and he said, "Don't poke the Russians with a stick." And we've still not learnt our lesson. We're still poking them with sticks. And if you think that Napoleon in 1812 tried to invade Russia, and again in 1941 Hitler did the same thing. Russia is a huge country, a vast country, and he attacked Russia in the summer when the troops were all in summer uniforms, and then they didn't re-equip them because the railway lines in Germany were wider than the railway lines in Russia, so they couldn't, the logistics, war is won on logistics. They couldn't get the sufficient stuff to Russia to service the German Wehrmacht and SS. Now the reason that Hitler invaded Russia was simple: oil. Germany had food at that time, it had steel, but is still short of oil, and that's the main reason why Hitler invaded Russia, was the Caucasus oil fields. And in my opinion, attacking on two fronts, a major front like Russia, and I'll discuss it further, was a huge mistake, and that's the other reason I think that Hitler lost World War II. Dunkirk, a big mistake, should have gone on, and Russia. Where were the Russians at this time? Where were the Germans at this time? If you think of it, they were all over, weren't they? They were in Normandy, yes, 59 divisions in Normandy. They were in Norway, 32 divisions in Normandy. They were in Russia, 169 divisions in Russia. They were in Greece. They were in Italy. Where do you get all the manpower to have those armies? So that's where the Germans were at this time, all over Europe, as you know, Benelux countries, Belgium, Holland, so vastly spread out. Personalities. Well, the major one is obviously Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler didn't allow his generals much room to be generals. He controlled the Wehrmacht, and in fact he also controlled the SS. So Hitler was, and also Hitler had on the night of the 5th, 6th of June, Hitler had gone to Beddybyes, and the generals, when they were warned by von Rundstedt and other people that the invasion happened, they didn't want to wake him. So Hitler was not awakened until 10:30 on the Monday, on the 6th of June. So you know they lost 4 hours of that time. So, but Hitler controlled, what we've got to understand, he controlled the armies, the Kriegsmarine and the Luftwaffe. He didn't trust his generals. So that was Hitler, sort of an overall command, gave his generals a certain amount of latitude, but that was it. Kurt von Rundstedt, slightly wasn't Kurt, it was Kurt von Rundstedt. Interesting guy. In conjunction with General Eisenhower, there are two things in common. They both liked reading westerns. And Zane Grey was a very popular author from America, part-time dentist, and von Rundstedt also loved westerns. Lived in great style in a chateau in Paris. Was famous for the fact that he had never lost a single campaign. He'd won all his campaigns, very well respected by both sides really. He was a Prussian professional soldier, despised unofficially Hitler, who he called the Bohemian Corporal. didn't like him at all. And he was in Russia, but he fell out again with Hitler, and Hitler had him removed from Russia and sent to Normandy. He said, because of the control put forward by Hitler, he hadn't got control of the army, the Western Army, which he'd got. And he said, the only people I actually control are the guards on my rooms. So, but I'll go in further detail of Kurt von Rundstedt with the personality with him and Rommel. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel of the Desert Rats fame, he was approached, ordered by Hitler in November 1943 to examine the defences in the Normandy area. Prior to that, there had been various discussions about where and when the invasion was going to happen. There was a lot of thought put forward, possibly they might invade in Norway. Obviously the Pas de Calais across the Channel because it was the shortest crossing, and they thought there. And then there was a thought by Hitler, it could be Normandy. So Erwin Rommel was sent in November 1943 to Normandy to examine the defences there and to put his sixpenneth in. But if you think of it, when he got there, he was really disheartened by what he saw. General Marx, who was the general in command of the 84 Corps at St. Louis, he was the guy in charge down there. He had charge of all the military there, the two divisions which I will come into. Interesting guy. It was his birthday, would you believe, on the 6th of June. He was 50 years old, and he was quite a dour introvert. He'd lost his leg. He was an artillery general and lost his leg in Russia, and therefore was posted into what was supposed to be a quiet area in St. Louis. So that was him. As a matter of interest, he was killed about 6 weeks later in the conflict in Normandy. But he was a great thinker, and he said very early on, if there's an invasion, it will be in Normandy. And he was right. Colonel Hermann von Open-Bronowski, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, but interesting guy. He was a cavalry commander of the old school, Panzer Regiment. He was interesting. He won the gold medal at the 1938 Olympics for dressage. Professional, really landed gentry. Wasn't a particularly lucky colonel, but he was the commander of 21 Panzer, which was based in Cannes. Interesting thing, the Germans had this thing about the tank being their weapon, and as you know, if you see all the films, it's always the tank. Actually, most of the German army was on horses. If you took an average company of soldiers, 26 of them were tied up with horses. If you go on to D-Day, you had 5 soldiers for every vehicle that was launched. The Germans had 5 soldiers for every horse. So can you imagine the logistics of feed, shoes, looking after the horses? But the Germans all through the war, and they lost something like 3 million horses in Russia alone. A lot of people don't seem to realize quite how horse-driven the Germans were. And they hadn't changed from World War I, exactly the same. So, Colonel commanded 21 Panzer. Interesting, there were 170 armoured vehicles there. Not many of them were actually German Mark IVs. There were Renault tanks, tanks from Czechoslovakia. So was their transport. A lot of it was not German manufactured. It was looted, if you like. And I'll come into that in greater depth later on. So those are the personalities at the time on D-Day. Okay, I'm going on to the personalities and the strategy. Very different. Von Rundstedt, commanding the western area, had 59 divisions in his control. And again, I'll go into that at greater depth. Von Rundstedt differed from Rommel. He wanted to have his armour, the panzers, near Paris, because he felt that any invasion that was going to happen was going to probably be in the Pas de Calais as opposed to Normandy. So he kept them way back near Paris so they could be deployed from the Paris area. Now that's quite a long way from Paris to Calais. But I mean, you know, Peter and I do it in about 2.5 hours in the car, but it's not quite the same thing. So that's what von Rundstedt believed, to keep it back. Whoops. What have I done wrong now? There we go. Rommel, of the Desert War, he had a very strong difference of opinion with Rundstedt, because he believed that, and I agree with him, you must destroy the enemy on the beaches. Once they break through and spread out, we can't control them. I haven't got the manpower to do it. So we must destroy them on the beaches. And to do that, I must have my armour forward. So he wanted his armour forward. Von Rundstedt wanted to be kept in Paris. So they took that to Hitler and had a big discussion with Hitler about it. And Hitler finally agreed that they would split the armour. Again, 3 divisions to go down to the Mediterranean. Sorry, 2 divisions to go down to the Mediterranean because there was still a threat down there. And then 3 divisions would be allocated to Normandy. That's 21 Panzer, 12 SS, and the other one was Lehr? Panzer Lehr, yeah. Those are the 3. So they were committed. Now, the SS always had the best equipment and the best tanks. So they did have modern tanks, i.e. Mark IV tanks, and they had the very heavy tank with the 88mm gun, the Tiger, the King Tiger. They had very well equipped. But the rest of the equipment, if you like, was, well, 1949, so it was 1940. So it was fairly obsolete by that time. So that's what they had, and Rommel wanted it up. And as I believe Rommel was right to keep his armour right forward so they could destroy the Allies on the beaches. Because once they broke through, then they were spread out. Now, intelligence of the German and the Allied, including Met. Sid and I have discussed this earlier on, but the Germans, in spite of what we all think about the Germans, they're very efficient, they were not very good on their intelligence. Intelligence is absolutely vital in any battle, everything. And they originally had the Abwehr, which was under Admiral Canaris. They weren't very good. They made cobblers of it wherever they were, the intelligence. So they were not very good, and then they were taken away, or dissolved if you like, and absorbed by the SS under Heinrich Himmler. Having said that, they weren't a lot better either. But so the intelligence, fortunately, was not brilliant for the Germans. Our intelligence was absolutely superb. You had the Royal Air Force flying their Spitfires at zero feet, taking photographs. You had aircraft going over high, and this is all over the Atlantic Wall, because we didn't want them to think it was just Normandy. They took it all the way up. So they had the aircraft, high sort of aircraft, and then we had the Spitfires flying at 0 feet. And it's an interesting fact that when going on to the actual invasion, when when American guy got to Utah Beach, and the guy at Utah Beach, the German, said he showed him the map he had. He said, all our positions are marked on your map. So they were that good. They were bang on with as far as they could get. So it was excellent on that point of view. for those of you who've seen the film The Longest Day, you've got the meteorological. Now the Germans were not as good as we were on the Met side, because we have, if you remember, we actually had a Met station in Southern Ireland on the borders, which gave us a warning, plus the fact we had the Royal Air Force flying out with maritime aircraft, and we had the Royal Navy. So our Met information was very good. And it was, again, came out of that Met because of the storms of the 5th, and to a certain extent the 4th, 5th and 6th. The Germans said to Rommel, oh, there will not be an invasion. It is far too rough. There will not be invasion, so it isn't going to happen. And that's one reason why Rommel went home to Germany, to Helm, to see his wife, because it was his wife's birthday. So he'd driven down there, the Field Marshal, and regrettably, very bad timing, the invasion happened. So that's von Rundstedt. He was on Rundstedt was about 66 at this time, and as I said earlier, had very high regards, I don't think, for Hitler. So that was it. And Rommel was about 52, 53. It's quite young. So that covers the difference in the strategy and the politics I've discussed before, which is Hitler, who didn't allow them to do anything really. He had control over the armed forces of Germany, which was a big mistake for a corporal. A principle of defence, a major principle of defence, is defend in depth. Because what you do is you have a front line, let's say, and then the people go back, attack that, and then you have another line and then another line, so you're actually slowing people down and causing casualties as they go along. So that was it's a well-established principle, defence in depth. They couldn't do that, and again I'll cover that again later on in the process. So defence in depth, they didn't do it. It was interesting that Hitler decided to have a concrete wall, the Atlantic Wall, fine, but then not so very long previous to that, they'd avoided the French, the famous Maginot Line. They'd gone round it, and they'd said that a line was not a tactical thing anymore, that it could be bypassed. So, and they did that in 1939, 1940. They bypassed it, but then he decides to build a wall, a concrete wall down the coast. Logic. So defence in depth. That's the Atlantic Wall, concrete wall, all the way down from Norway all the way down to Spain. I think we're talking about 17.1 million tons of concrete and 2.1 million tons of steel. For something we think was obsolete by then, but it was there, looking very, very grand. And if you go to Normandy now, as Peter does, and I do, and you see these concrete boxes, but but it was their defence system. The Todt organisation, that was a paramilitary organisation, and basically there's two. You had the guys who were paid by the German, and some of them were French engineers. Vast amount of slave labour, phenomenal amount of slave labour from all the countries that the Germans had occupied, and they literally worked these people to death. If you go over Normandy, as I do, and you see what they built over the period, and it was all done by slave labour. Now, at the time of D-Day, just before the beginning of 1944, because the German cities were being decimated by the bombing system, a lot of these slave labour were pulled away to repair and clear out the damage caused by the Bomber Command in Germany. So from doing an awful lot of work, they were being withdrawn. And that is fairly obvious when you go to Normandy. You see a number of the gun emplacements which have never been finished. Yeah, what they built was weapon nests because, again, and I'll discuss it, it's a shortage of troops. They had weapon nests where they either had an awful lot of machine guns, or they had mortars, or they had the coastal artillery. Show you again the diversity. All coastal artillery, the big guns, were controlled by the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy. So there was a split command straight away. All the coastal artillery was commanded by them. So the only control they had was of sort of what I call anti-tank weapons, smaller caliber guns, and machine gun nests. And what they did, they built an awful lot of these weapon nests all over the Normandy area. And they would either have guns in it, field guns, or they'd have mortars where they had a lot of mortar fire, or they had machine gun, and you all know about the famous M34 and M42 machine guns, which were vastly superior to our Bren guns, not as accurate, but if you think the cycle rate of M42 was 1,200 rounds a minute. And those of you who had a Bren gun, 28 round magazine, that's it. So the weapon nest on Omaha, and I'll go into that greater depth, but this is what they did. So they got the bunkers, but they got these weapon nests. Where were the German Air Force? Well, the German Air Force had been pulled back to defend the German cities because of the bombers going and bombing. They were pulled back, and so I think in Normandy there were only 2 Messerschmitt 109s left in Abbeville, and they sort of attacked the beaches and did a few strafing runs and then went back out because they hadn't got. The Luftwaffe was no longer the Luftwaffe of 1940. It was being decimated. A lot of their best pilots had been killed in Russia. And the Navy, where were the Navy? Right, well, the Navy, there were submarines in Brest and places like that, but all the capital ships, the Tirpitz and that sort of thing, were in Normandy. Sorry, in Norway. So all they had in Le Havre was some coastal minesweepers and the famous German E-boat. They had 8 German E-boats, which were, well, really like a large MTB or a small destroyer, whichever you like to speak, and they attacked on D-Day and managed to sink the Norwegian destroyer. But that's all they had, because all their capital ships were north, and the submarines were in Brest. And actually it was interesting, one of the comments I read was the fact that the German admiral said it is far better to lose a submarine firing 1 torpedo at a tank landing craft and be lost. Interesting philosophy. If I was commanding a U-boat, I would have the second thoughts, I think. So that's defense in depth, and I'll go into greater depth. Atlantic Wall, the Todd organisation, weapon nests, and where were the German Air Force and Navy. Right, interesting. In 1940, a German division was 16 to 17,000 soldiers strong. A lot of soldiers. That's a division. There were 169 German divisions in Russia. In 1943, they were down to 12,000 strong. The casualty rate in Russia was 35,000 troops a month they were losing. So that was that. And if you think in 1940 you had a very, very professional, well-managed army in 1943, those troops are no longer of the same caliber as the 1940 troops. Right, let's go a bit further. Right, defending Normandy, you have two what we call static divisions. 709 and 716, they were static. So they were between 7,000 and 8,000 troops strong. Very interesting. Of those 7,000 to 8,000 troops, up to a third of them were non-German. The Germans would go to POW camps or concentration camps and say to the men, would you like to join the German army where you'll get fed, uniform and looked after? It didn't give, you know, if I was in a POW camp suffering those rations, I would have volunteered for the German Wehrmacht. So up to a third of the troops in those static divisions was non-German, and therefore, you know, what sort of morale and what sort of loyalty have you got to the German Wehrmacht there? And they were known as static divisions. In other words, they stayed there. Now, Normandy was quite interesting. Okay, they got paid, but also there was a big black market with the local residents where you could have some cider, calvados, butter, cheese, and ham, and they'd do a trade-off. For some reason, there was a shortage of bootlaces and lamp oil. So the Germans used to trade their laces and lamp oil for the food and the stock they have. So that was where they liked it. And of course they'd been there a while and be nice and comfort. A static division. Do you know they didn't have any transport at all? They had bicycles, they had horses, and in one of the divisions the only vehicle was the general's staff car. So they manned those. They manned the positions. They also lived in farms and that sort of thing. But they were only 7,000 to 8,000 strong. And also the other thing is, a lot of the troops that came there were invalids, i.e., you probably heard the expression stomach battalions. A lot of them had come from Russia to recruit. They'd lost fingers through the frost. They'd lost eyelids. They'd been wounded, not fit for any further combat experience. And so you got that on it. And any troops that recovered sufficiently well were moved out of those divisions back to Russian front. So morale was not brilliant. They hadn't got the equipment. They were very, very far down the scale of equipment, i.e. their rations apparently were pretty poor, but of course they did some bargaining to get the stuff from Calvados and such like. So that was the static divisions, and they just stood there. And the two ones that I'm talking about are 709 and 716, because they were the divisions that would have put opposing, if you like, the invasion of Normandy. So I said earlier we had 150,000 troops landing during the course of the day against probably a maximum of 28,000 Germans on the ground. So pretty spread out. Interesting one. 351 Infantry Division was a professional division who'd been mauled in Russia and were posted to Saint-Lô with General Marx. These were a professional soldiers. The British intelligence didn't pick this up because they came over in late May, June, so they got no record. They aware something had happened, but they didn't know who it was, so they'd come across at that time. And actually there was a whole division of them, but only one battalion was actually involved in D-Day, and they give the Americans a very hard time at Omaha because of their professional attitude, and also they did a very good job at Gold Beach. They're being professional. They were in a place called Port-au-Bessin, and they damaged 4-7 Commander who went there, and they were very, very tenacious, and they sort of hung on to the very bitter end. So that was 351 Infantry Division, which were in Saint Lô, part of General Marx's battalion, or troops. Also, there was a cycle battalion of German paratroopers there under von der Heydt, who were mounted on bicycles. So so if you think 28,000, and that was a maximum against 150,000, that's not. Weapon scale. This is, again, because an awful lot of the weapons were weapons that had been acquired in their combat going through Europe, through the Benelux countries, through Czechoslovakia. A lot of the weapons they got were non-German weapons. They were both in the armour. For example, the Renault tank. They'd taken the Renault tank turret off it, planted it, and were using the static turret as an anti-tank weapon, and they would turn a handle to traverse it because there was obviously no mechanics on it. So they did that, and so a lot of the equipment they got was really obsolete by that time. 18 different types of ammunition. So once you'd used the ammunition, where are you going to get more from? There were 18 different types of ammunition, and again I go back to what I said. Wars are won by logistics, getting the supplies there, and they hadn't got sufficient ammunition in lots of cases. So once they'd fired their 60 shells, that was it. So an obsolete scale. And likewise with the troops, they'd got First World War rifles in lots of cases, stuff they'd acquired. They did have the M34 machine gun, and they did have the M41 machine gun. So they had very good mortars. So that is that's the weapon scale they had, and it's what I'm trying to say. It's not the nice, shining German tanks that you saw. They were fairly obsolete tanks. The weather. Now, you've heard, the weather was bad. Yeah, it was. And Eisenhower decided to go ahead because they decided they weren't going to do it on the 5th, but there was going to be a weather window, so they would go on the 6th, which they did. But please bear in mind, the sea was still rough. You know, it didn't go from a nice storm to a flat calm. The sea was rough, and that's had an awful lot of influence on things. The soldiers were seasick, and those of you who've been seasick, it's not a pleasant experience. So the soldiers were seasick. They were going up and down, and the invasion fleet was going. The troop carrying engagement was going at 4.5 knots, which is 6 miles an hour. So it takes you an awful long time to go from the various southern ports to Normandy. So the weather was a factor, and as I said earlier, that's why Rommel decided to go and see his wife on the birthday, because the weather was not so good, and his weather organizer had said, oh, they're not going to invade in this weather, it's too bad. The troops have been there, in some cases, since 1941. They were bored, they were sitting, they'd been there for ages, you know, bored, nothing happening. They knew there was going to be an invasion, but where and when? So the troops and the morale of the troops was not good. You know, you got Russians, you got Poles, you got some French, you got all manner of nationality, Italians. They were bored stiff, no telly. Where and when will it come? They knew it was going to come, but where? Calais? Norway? So they didn't know where. So you got the weather, boredom, and when and where will it come? Air activity. very little air activity from the German point of view. The Allies, yes, big bombing raids, 11,500 aircraft. Yeah, so they were very sensible or clever. They didn't put it all through Normandy. They put it all over, so that it was very difficult to predict exactly where these things were happening, because the bombing raids are happening all over. So, you've got to hand it to the Allied intelligence, and the way they did it was very good. Having said that, where would we have been without the Americans? Right, this is the message that the Germans had got from High Command. Hold the beaches, the armour will be there in 2 hours. That's what their commitment. They said, we will get the armour to protect you within 2 hours of, you just hold the beach for 2 hours. Utah Beach. Now, interesting. Yeah, this is quite. All the beaches were very different in aspects. Utah Beach, which was sand dunes, very flat. So you got Utah Beach, was the first beach to be landed on at 6:30 in the morning. The interesting fact is that it was commanded by a Brigadier General Roosevelt, who was the son of the late president, and he was 58. He was the oldest general to land on D-Day, probably one of the oldest full stop to land on D-Day, but he was the oldest. Died about 6 weeks later from a massive heart attack, but he was suffering from arthritis. Now, what was interesting or fascinating about Utah is the fact that because it was so rough and the wind, they didn't land where they'd planned to land. They landed just over a mile further down the coast, which was a blessing, because that area was very lightly defended, and the Germans had flooded the area to the rear in depth, but the actual area was not that difficult to invade. And the story is that Roosevelt got there and said, we will start the invasion from here, which they did. And fair play for the Navy, the American Navy. The Commodore of the Navy said, I will get all the ships diverted further down the coast. So they landed on this beach, on the fairly flat beach. And they landed just, low water was at 6:15, and as you go down the coast, so the low water was at slightly different times because the tide was starting to turn. Interesting, the Germans said that when there was an attack or the invasion, that the Allies would land at high water. The Allies decided to land at just after low water, which meant that most of the obstacles that in-depth obstacles were visible, because what Rommel did in depth, instead of having the troops, he put a succession of obstacles on the beach of different types, and on the tops of some of them they had mines, and on some of them they had old shells, so that as the tide got higher, a number of the landing craft hit the mines and were blown up. So, but the difference was that the Allies decided to land just after low water, where they could see the obstacles, whereas the Germans said they would land at high water because there was less beach to cross. Low water, you got 300 to 400 meters. At high water, probably 100, 150 meters. So that was the difference. But Utah, they only lost 212 people at Utah because they landed further south. And those of you who've been to Utah, you can see where they should have landed, which is an awful lot of pillboxes there and guns. And when you go down to where they actually landed, there was only one strong point, which is now a cafe, so you can have a nice meal there if you like. So that's the difference between Utah and the fact that they only lost a very few men. But to the rear of it, the other side of the sand dunes, the area was flooded very heavily. So the number of, just to digress, the number of the paratroopers from the 101st and 82nd Airborne who were there to stop the flanks, a number of them drowned in these, because they were carrying such an awful lot of gear, they drowned in these flooded areas. Omaha, this is famous, bloody Omaha, where the Americans lost in the region of 3,000 troops in the opening part of the war. A lot of it really, again, it's dead easy for me to say that, was their own fault. You've heard of the funnies that General Hobart created, the tanks that were flotation tanks, tanks that could lay roadways, tanks that had a large gun on the front that could blow a pillbox up. He invented all these things, and the one he invented was a thing called the duplex drive tank, which had a canvas screen which was put up by using CO2 cylinders or air cylinders, and the tank would then be was waterproofed, and two little propellers at the back end would send this little tank ashore. Now, it was only designed to do a maximum of 4.5 to 5 knots. Now, the Americans, the 100 Division, the big red 100, these guys had fought an awful lot of wars already, so I don't know what the morale would have been like, thinking, how long have I got, before my chips are up. But they were there, and the generals were offered some of Hobart's tanks, and they said, no, we don't want them. No, we don't want them. In the end, they agreed to have some of them. So they were given 32 of these duplex drive tanks. And they launched them 5 miles out to sea. And out of the 32 tanks, only 5 made it ashore. 27 with their crews drowned, because it was choppy. It wasn't a nice level sea. So they got 5 tanks ashore, and the whole thing about infantry is if you've got tank support, you've got tanks firing on the pillboxes and this sort of thing, and they got 5. And by the time they got 5 ashore, 1 got blown up straight away, so they were down to 4 when the Americans landed. So they were pretty well hammered from the beginning. So let's look at Omaha. No, Omaha. Omaha is 5 miles long, wide, and was very heavily defended with guns, and I think it was like 18 strong points and 84 machine gun posts. So an awful lot of the beach was 5 miles long. And have anybody heard of Pont de Hoc? Now, Pont de Hoc is one end of the beach, and then you've got Ormonge, the other end of the beach. So you've got 5 miles of beach. Pont de Hoc was a gunnery position which had got coastal artillery on it, and the American Rangers decided that their job was to go up and take up Pont de Hoc. And the Pont de Hoc, and I'll hopefully show you a photograph, was 100 feet high. And the American Rangers borrowed ladders from the London Fire Service to get as well as they firing grapples up the hill. But they fought a very hard battle to get to the top of this cliff. And when they got there, they found the guns had been taken away. So, but the whole beach was 5 miles long and wide, and at each end, and halfway down as well, they'd got machine guns firing into the troops, and that's why they had huge casualties. And one machine gun is reputed to have fired 18,000 rounds of ammunition. Oops. So he's known as Bloody Omaha, and if you go there, the Corville-Sully, which is where the American cemetery is, there are the graves of 3,000 plus Americans who lost their lives fighting Omaha. The other thing about Omaha, it was the only beach that had a high cliffs. Cliffs about 80 feet tall, more like a bluffs, you know, you could get into them, but they were about 80 feet tall, and that was high ground. So the Omaha was probably the most difficult beach to attack. But in my opinion, purely in my opinion, the Americans didn't do themselves any favors by refusing help and also launching the DDs so far out. And also the assault boats had a long way to come in. And the Germans were very good in one respect. They held their fire until the Americans hit the beach. And you saw 351 Infantry Division, which were regulars. There was almost 3 companies of those on that beach. So they gave them a hard time. Yeah. Well, all these beaches were different. Omaha, you got high cliffs, and a long beach, and you could have what's called enfiladed fire. So in other words, you could fire along the beach, and also out to sea. So they did have quite a hammering. I said 3,000 troops were killed. Gold Beach, again, interesting Gold Beach, very flat, but the defensive position was about half a kilometre on the bluffs, and that's where the only VC that was won was what was his name? Peter?
Stan Hollis.
Stan Hollis won a VC on Gold Beach, but but again, if you think the Germans had put something like 2 million mines down, and each mine, a lot of these mines were covered by automatic fire, and on Omaha there were an awful lot of mines there on the beach with a long approach up the slope to where the German defensive position was. So that's gold. Juno, Canadian beach, Juno. A lot of houses on the beach. If you've ever been there, there's a lot of houses on the front. And what the Germans did, they reinforced those houses. So those houses became pillboxes, if you like. And again, the assaulting position was fairly short, and the Canadians lost a lot of troops invading Juno Beach. Sword Beach, which is the British beach. I mean, Gold and Sword were British beaches. Sword, which was probably the most heavily defended beach in Normandy, because it's the Port of Oostrum. So the ports were heavily defended, a bit like La Havre and up the Cherbourg, in Cherbourg itself. Hitler knew that an army would require ports, so therefore the ports like Calais were very heavily defended. It didn't occur that a Bangor lad from North Wales would design a harbour called the Arromanches harbours and get them towed with 150 tugs from all over Britain to the beaches, and an artificial port was created. And I'm very proud that it was designed by a Welshman from Bangor, and all he got was an OBE. So Sword Beach was again a port, very heavily defended by coastal artillery, a Merville battery, which was on a high ground. If you're looking out to sea, to the right, again that was 9 Parachute Regiment, 9 para under Colonel Otway landed to take the Merville battery out, but because of the weather and the wind, instead of having a battalion of 650, he had 70. So he decided to take the battery out with 70 soldiers, which they did. But they had the Merville battery, and then interesting that the batteries were named after fish. So you had cod on the front and skate to the side. So these were heavy coast batteries, again controlled by the Navy. An interesting factor is to the rear of Oostrum was a complex of batteries known as the Hillman battery, the Morris battery, the Daimler battery. I don't think it was a Ford battery, but they were all named after cars. Now, interesting fact on the Hillman battery, you're talking about 650 troops in all these batteries, was commanded by Oberst Krug, who was a colonel in the Wehrmacht. Notice the name Krug. In his cellar, in the bunker, when it was relieved, it was found full of champagne. Now, you all know that Krug is one of the finest champagne houses in Epinera or Reims. So, but he was obviously related in some respects to the Krug family, because the regiment that Stafford's wasn't the Staffords, was it? Suffolk. I knew it began with S. Suffolk's. They liberated it, and they probably got pissed on all the champagne in the cellar. So those were the major beaches which I've covered. And again, if you go back to the beginning, we're talking about a maximum of 7,000 to 8,000 troops. So you 16,000, and how many were actually on the ground? Because a lot of them, as soon as they ran, they surrendered straight away. What do they want to fight for? So a lot of them surrendered straight, and they didn't want to be there. So the conclusions of it were a failure to hold the beaches, because there weren't many troops to ground, and the Allies bypassed them. So there was a failure to hold the beaches as per what the High Command said, and a failure to counterattack because they couldn't get the armour up there, predominantly due to the fact that 12 SS and Lear were being stonked by Typhoons, Mustangs and the air forces, so they could only move at night, and they were losing a phenomenal amount of armour through the Allied Air Force bombing, strafing and doing that sort of thing. So they couldn't get there. So the failure, in my opinion, was the failure to hold the beaches, which is what Rommel said. You need to hold them, kill them on the beaches, and it was the longest day, and failure to counterattack. The Germans had always been very, very good at counterattacking anything. If a position was taken, they would counterattack straight away. They didn't do on this occasion because they couldn't get the armour up there, because von Rundstedt had kept the armour back. So those were the conclusions we had. So I hope that has been I hope you found it fairly interesting. If you've got any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. If I can't answer them, Peter can.
One of the things that the Germans were up against also was that because they were holding an invaded country, the French resistance must have.
Yeah, but I did say that about the intelligence that we're getting from the Marquis. Sorry.
Merfyn, that was fantastic, thank you. Can you say anything at all about the other participants, i.e. the French local population? Were they, because I know that parts of southern England, for example, were evacuated for security reasons. Did the Germans do the same?
They did in some cases, but very, very few cases, because the French decided to stay. But in very, very few cases that the French stayed on. And what is interesting, in a couple of the trips we've done with Peter and Janet to France is that these villages, the villages were there, and then when D-Day happened, the SS put them into churches, two of them, and set fire to the churches. I know that's been sort of documented very heavily, but I didn't realise that in the area of Falaise that they'd done the same thing to, so they'd been pretty ruthless to the French, and there was not a lot of love lost. But of course, also, indeed, an awful lot of innocent French civilians were killed, and especially Caen later on. But if you're fighting a war, and unfortunately, civilians get killed, and also the bombing by the American Air Force wasn't the most accurate. They were going to bomb, and this was sort of to protect the troops, but they thought, oh no, we mustn't bomb too near the beachhead because we'll damage our troops. So they bombed further inland, which was useless. So you had literally thousands of tons of bombs doing nothing at all. Sir?
I think there's some evidence of something like 3,000 French civilians were killed during the Normandy campaign.
That's right.
The other interesting thing is that Hitler was still convinced it was going to go through the Port de Calais for a long time because we turned their agents.
I agree with you. I agree with what you're saying, but I think that he'd formulated later on the 6th that it was the main event. You know, but I mean, he didn't get up until 10:30, did he? You know, so but he had decided with Rommel that he thought it was going to be in Normandy. But as you said, you know, if you go to the Pas de Calais, you've got that famous the Tot battery, which a gun would you could actually shoot a cannon, and it would land in either Dover or in Folkestone. You know, so but by that time he was convinced, although there was still this thought that the main event, because of Patton being on the southern coast with the fictitious army, the Patton would be going across the channel.
Wasn't Hitler convinced for Calais in that, because we'd done some deception? We'd dropped an agent or a body, hadn't we?
No, that was Sicily.
Sicily, sorry.
And a man with no name. But
yes,
what actually happened was, in about 1942, a plan was evolved called Operation Sledgehammer, which was theoretically to invade France through Calais, or the Calais area. But the man with no name, the Royal Marine Major, again a Welshman, the body was anyway, the Welshman, was for the invasion of Sicily.
But they did, there was the Patton's Third Army, and the dummy tanks were kept, you got quite right, in Kent and Sussex, with a whole series of rubber tanks and rubber vehicles, and also radio traffic, because the Germans feared of all the Allied commanders was Patton. Even though he was unpopular in many things, I mean, he was old blood and guts, was someone that they knew would actually, and of course when he did eventually land on the 1st of August, I mean, it was his army that drove, you know, towards Paris and down into deeper into France. I mean, he was, you know, I mean, one all knows about Patton with his silver holsters, but he was a real, you know, he was more in the German spirit, if you like. But I mean, of course, a lot of men said, well, it was blood and guts. A lot of the GIs said, his blood, our guts. Well, his guts, our blood, I think. Yeah.
I think the other thing is they also had landing craft there as well.
Yeah,
rubber and so
on. Absolutely, yeah.
And they also, at the time of the invasion, 617 did the flights dropping tinsel.
Yeah, 617 squadron landing every 13 seconds.
Yeah, and that gave the impression on radar that actually ships were coming towards the Port of Calais at the same time as they were invading Normandy.
Yeah, I've tried to keep it to generalities and not get down too much in the nitty-gritty, but you know, every time I go and every time I swat it up, if you like, I thought, I didn't know that. So it's amazing what you don't know, and every time, and Peter will bear me out, every time I go to Normandy, I learn something new. I think, crikey, didn't know that. I mean, we went to Port-au-Bessin, which lovely hotel, and that was right on where the Americans and the Brits met, and that's where the Pluto pipeline came ashore in Port-au-Bessin. Nice fishing village, lovely fish restaurants if you go, very good indeed. Any other questions, or are you too hungry, or have you been bored stiff?
I just found that really interesting, and I've made lots of notes, so thank you very much.
Well, my wife will be jealous. hear that. Thank you.